Hey guys, Abel speaking here. Well, actually, if you want to be precise with the pronunciation of my name, it's Abel. But anyway, today's guest requires no introduction really. This guy has been in the industry for over 20 years now, and he's the author of several highly successful books, such as the Rapid Fat Loss Handbook and the Stubborn Fat Loss Protocol. He takes pride at looking at the objective reality and scientific evidence instead of creating clickbait type of headlines and giving people the bottom line. He's known for his no bullshit approach and analytical mind, and that's exactly why I sought him out for today's episode. Yes, I'm talking about the man himself, Lyle Mcdonald from bodyrecomposition.com. Now, as a warning, this interview is well over an hour, so do yourself a favor and look at the timestamps in the description of the video if you're short on time. We talked about behavior-based nutritional approach for the general public, how to be less receptive to bullshit from internet gurus, delved into the rise and fall of diet trends, and touched on the works of people such as Gary Taubes. We also geeked out on some nutritional stuff for those of you fitness geeks. So we talked about the required carb intake for natural lifters, the optimal dietary fat intake during bulking and for optimizing testosterone levels, and even touched briefly on alcohol consumption. So lots of good stuff here, which I hope you'll love. So without further ado then, here's my interview with Lyle Mcdonald.
You are someone on the cutting edge, always looking into how to optimize every little detail of a nutrition plan.
Right.
But in every book of yours, you start with a big disclaimer saying that this is appropriate for a small minority of people, and for a large number of people don't need to worry about these details.
Yes.
So with that, I would be curious, who is your favorite kind of target audience or population to write to as an author?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think it's one thing people often forget. Right? A lot of people that are in this industry, are very interested in optimizing, and they're at 15% body fat. They're trying to get to 8%, and the details really matter when you're a high-level athlete, when you're doing a lot of training. And I think it's easy to forget that the general public, their diets are usually so terrible that any change, will benefit them. Even some of the simple diets of the don't eat some particular food that they're overeating frequently works really well. They, aren't interested in that level of detail. And B, I think that level of detail tends to scare them off. I've seen complete beginners go in and, they're trainers, a bodybuilder or someone very involved in physique. And the first day they're told you have to eat 6 small meals, this amount of lean protein. And they hear that and go, I can't do that. It's an impossible expectation. I mean, yeah, there's the people that want all those details right off the bat. But I think for the general public, small changes have huge effects. I had a client, I'll get to your specific question. I just want to kind of address this. I had a client years ago, and he was drinking something like 4, full regular sugary sodas a day. It was something, and I said, you know what? Just switch to diet or water. Just make that one change. And he started losing, 1.5 pounds to 2 pounds a week because he took, what is that? 800 calories. It's just over 3,000 kilojoules per day out of his diet without just that one small change. Of course, as people get from beginners carrying a lot of body fat sort of into the intermediate range to the very lean range, they have to become a lot more detail oriented. So far as, which population do I enjoy working with more or prefer writing for, I actually think both are important. Like, I'm very interested in the details. I've always found the issue of getting someone, a male to single-digit body fat or a female to, 12% without muscle loss, without performance loss. I find that a fascinating topic just because it is so difficult. Especially without drugs. Drugs have really drugs make a lot of the problems go away. So you get hormonal adaptations, muscle, all of that. At the same time, I know that's 10% of the total dieting population. Even from a practical financial standpoint, writing for that is fun and interesting, but it won't really pay the bills. So I also think there's a lack of really good information for the general public. Most popular diet books are crap. They're getting better, but it's a lot of garbage. I think a lot of people don't realize the issues, right? You see, I remember years ago, and people would write these, beginner exercise programs. It's like, oh, let's start with body weight exercises and do a T push-up, and they weigh 160 pounds. I'm like, are you really telling me that a 300-pound beginner, male or female, is going to have the strength to do a one? You got to be kidding me. I've had people at that, to walk for 10 minutes continuously on a treadmill was exhausting for them. To think that, oh yeah, we're going to start with body weight stuff, you got to be kidding me. But they have no conception of that. If you've never weighed more than 160 or never worked with that level, that kind of clientele, you have no concept of what that person is going through. And I think a lot of folks forget that. They forget what it was like to be a beginner. They don't realize that they don't represent a lot of their clientele. So I try to take that into account and provide, what I think is better information. Because as much as anything else, kind of getting off topic, we know that weight loss is unsuccessful for many. And there's a lot of reasons for that. It is not easy in the modern environment. However, I think the way that people approach dieting and just the types of diets they're exposed to in the general public are so appallingly bad. I don't know what they have in the rest of the country. Here, you pick up any magazine at the checkout counter of the grocery store, and it's just crap. It's like walk off 20 pounds in a week. Here's the broth that will bump up your thyroid. And it's like, this is part of the reason for the failure, is the diets they're getting, the dietary advice they're getting are terrible. The psychology, and this is what gets into the flexible dieting thing. People think that, oh, I'm dieting. I'm supposed to be miserable. The food is supposed to taste like cardboard. How is that possibly sustainable in the long term? Actually, the group that will do that are the psychophysique athletes. You tell them to eat chicken breast and broccoli every meal, they'll do it. They're obsessives with subclinical eating disorders. The general public, they can do that for a while. And I think that's a big part of the failure. So that was a big genesis, I think, behind the flexible dieting thing. All the research shows that those kind of flexible dieting attitudes help with long-term success and maintenance. So I like both. I think both are important, both from a problematic standpoint. I would say that the lean athlete, it's more physiological problems. Psychologically, they're easy. They'll do whatever you tell them. For the general public, I think the psychological, behavioral stuff is far more important, because any change to their diet will probably be an improvement.
I was trying to design kind of a training program for a friend of mine, trying to get him into the gym. And his biggest struggle is that he just felt so uncomfortable between all the meatheads in the gym.
Oh, yeah.
That actually the whole thing actually never ever came through. And I realized that I need to tackle the whole issue from a completely different standpoint. Like that the whole issue is not with the training. It's somewhere completely different.
And that's extremely common, over in the U.S., the gym that's probably as divisive as anything is Planet Fitness. And, it was started by Greg Everson, who actually was a bodybuilder and Olympic lifter, way back in the day. And I think he saw that there was a market for that, because you walk into Gold's Gym or World Gym here, and as a complete beginner, overweight beginner, and that's what you see. You see a lot, very large percentage of, you got the big muscular guys, you've got the women who are already in shape, and it's very intimidating. Their attitudes are often, bodybuilders can be very elitist, and it's a very difficult population to be around. So you started Planet Fitness, and as much as the hardheads complain about it, they will kick you out if you're making too much, if you're dropping weights and being that guy. They really want to make it accessible to the general public, right? And there's a lot of complaining in that hardhead community. Oh, Planet Fitness won't even let you deadlift. You know what? I don't care. A beginner doesn't need to be deadlifting. Most people that I've seen deadlift don't do it well anyway, so who cares? Yeah. Anything that gets them started is progress, right? We have a huge problem with this. And yes, some people will never go past that, but who cares? Some percentage will get more serious. They may move to a different gym, but giving them that opportunity and that ability to go someplace where they're not going to be hassled or surrounded by that is huge. And you know what? It's one of the most successful gym chains ever. And I think that's really telling. You know, the hardheads complain, I can't work out there. You know what? It's not for you. You've got plenty of options. You can go slam weights and scream and be that guy. I deal with that every day at my gym, which is fine. Planet Fitness is not for you. So don't complain, because if you actually care about fitness and health and people, anything that gets them going works. But what these guys care about is that what they do is right. And you got to squat, you got to deadlift, you got to bench press. I'm sorry, but that's BS.
Yeah.
Anything is better than nothing for the general public.
Yeah, actually, that just brings to mind that I think Eric Helms was that I heard phrasing it this way, that kind of the fitness and nutrition sphere almost reflects the economic sphere, in that there is no middle class anymore. You're either obese or you're a fitness professional. Basically, there's no in between.
Yeah, and like I said, the fitness professional typically comes from a very different population. You know, I started working out in high school, and from the get-go, you know, I was very interested in it, got very serious about it. It's easy to forget that. It's easy to forget, the typical high school guys, like, goes to the gym, is like, man, I want to get jacked. Put me through my paces. Do whatever it takes. That's not a 30-year-old woman who's never exercised, who's out of shape, who's intimidated. But it's that first group that ends up as the professionals, and it's that other group that, you'll frequently see people that started out active and they understand. They have a completely different mindset and mind model. So yeah, I agree with Eric completely about that. Unfortunately, the people giving the advice are almost by definition the group that has no conception. They have no perspective for a grand majority of their audience. Right.
And so that just brings to mind, so now you're writing the book, I know, about women's fat loss. I kind of heard you mention it, that you're also working on a book which is more about general behavior change and kind of nutrition for general public, or?
So what happened, this was at the beginning of last year, and I started this book, actually out of spite, very honestly. Someone had plagiarized my guide to flexible dieting, claimed that they pioneered it, and that just made me angry. So I decided to go back, because that book was written in 2004. I've learned, obviously, a lot since then. It's kind of a rough book. So I went back and looked at it and started editing it. I was like, I should add this, and I should add that, and I should add the other, and suddenly it was turning into this epic project. Because one thing I haven't really done much of is written, general fat loss. I've had some very specific diets. Ultimate Diet was for very lean dieters. Stubborn Fat Solution, same thing. Guide to Flexible Dieting is probably the closest I've done to some general, but it was more focusing on the behavioral stuff with the diet on tacked in. So I'm like, you know what? I'm just going to write a comprehensive book, cover every topic, including a lot of behavioral stuff that I'd gotten into, because I really think that's the key for the general public, right? We know how to make people lose weight. We've known that for 40 years or longer. We know what to do. Getting people to do it for more than 3 weeks, that's what we can't seem to figure out. How do we get them to do it, long term, right? Everyone loses weight over a year, whatever the studies are, and by year 3, half of them overgain most of it. By year 5, it's basically 70 or 80%. Like, why? What's the hang up? And I think there's a lot of different stuff that goes into it. But yeah, so I started that book, and I was just pulling information that was either on my website, in other books, to just make it completely comprehensive. So of course it got out of control. It's about 95% done, and I got to the section on women and fat loss. And women have more difficulty generally, a lot of different issues that they're having to deal with, hormonal, et cetera, different social pressures, which is a big part of it. And I was like, I need to address this. When I got into it, I'm like, it'll take a few chapters. And I'm like, it'll take longer than that. All the women, of course, were like, we need this book. And suddenly it spiraled out into its own ridiculous project. So the big book that's kind of on hold really is going to be comprehensive. It covers everything from underlying physiology, diet setup, adjustments, training. Like, it's going to, and that way I don't ever have to write anything about fat loss again. I will have put it all in this one book. Anything that's not in there either isn't important, or it basically just it's not important to the big picture. The women's book has completely gotten out of control. Women have so many issues that men simply don't. Their hormones are changing every month. You add birth control, you add, some women have elevated testosterone, polycystic ovary syndrome, you add premenopause, postmenopause. Women's hormones change in a way that men's don't, right? Men's are just kind of flat all month, and over the lifespan, they just kind of go down. Women's are crazy every month, and then at menopause, they turn off. And their bodies fight back harder, they use fuel differently, they have different nutrient requirements, and this is something that kind of by and large has been ignored. Most training, most studies have been done on men. They still are. Like about 80% of research is still done on men because they're easier to study, right? You can bring a man into the lab and study him on any day of the month. For women, you have to standardize where in the month you are, based on when their period starts. Birth control changes that. I talked to, I think, was it Brad Schoenfeld? I was talking to somebody at the ISSN conference, and they were like, yeah, we wanted to study some women, and we wanted to study them on this day. And she started her period a day early. We got to wait a month because the hormones have changed now. Like, women are much more difficult and complicated to study, and the reality is that they just frequently aren't for that reason. But it's turning out that in most aspects of really everything, they do need to be treated different. The principles still hold, make no mistake. The generalities still hold, but in terms of the specifics, they have less lean body mass, their fat is stored differently. Obviously, it gets mobilized differently, it gets stored differently. They have different, most training comes from men, and women are just assumed to be a smaller version of them. And it's really not the case. So that book it's completely out of control. It is driving me slightly crazy just because the deeper I look, the more I find. Like, it's just the differences are almost never ending, but it is coming along, and I hope to have that done. It's actually, I'm probably have to split it into 2 books because it's already over 400 pages, and that's just too much.
Yeah. Actually, so 2 things. One is you did a really cool episode with a podcast episode with Jeff Nippard. Mm-hmm. So people who are really curious on the details on women's fat loss, I would like to direct them to that podcast. Jeff. Yeah,
what we talked about with him. So yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, Jeff, cool guy. I also interviewed him on my podcast, and mm-hmm. So just before we start to geek out on some nutritional stuff, I'm curious. You, someone being in the industry for like 20 years or something, what do you do when you're at a dinner, let's say at a friend's house, and there is some vocal guy at the dinner table talking about like and you shouldn't eat, I don't know, after 8 p.m. because that all turns into fat or whatever, like some BS, basically nutritional BS.
Personally, at this point in my life, I don't bother. I learned when I was much younger, I was far more vocal in terms of trying to change people's minds. It's the nature of the beast. I still see like folks like Alan Aragon do it. He's just determined. He debated Gary Taubes, and it's just like, dude, it's a waste of time. Quite frankly, it's a waste of time. Anyone who already agrees with you will continue to agree with you. Anyone who is bought into Taubes is not going to change their mind. They're just not, right? They've bought what he has to say. Taubes won't change his mind. Over the 10 years since that book came out, I've watched Gary Taubes just keep changing what he's exactly saying. Because every time the data says, dude, you're completely wrong, he just goes, well, I'm going to change what I'm arguing so that I'm still technically right. He's just moved his goal, because there's too much money to make. He's moved his goalposts like every year for a decade. It doesn't matter how, at most there's a tiny percentage in the middle that you might sway with it. To me, there's also something called the backfire effect. The people who believe in something, it's really weird. The more evidence you give them that they're wrong, the harder they believe in the nonsense. Like, it's a weird aspect of human psychology because I think it's an ego challenge. They don't want to have to come back and, you know what, I was wrong. So I used to do that, and it serves no purpose. So I've gotten to the point that basically if someone asks me a question, I will give them the best answer that I can. I wait for them to come to me now. My website, I realize, is not, it has a fairly small following. I'm interested in the people who are ready for the information I'm ready to provide, mainly because I started out young and bitter, and now I'm just old and bitter. I tried for so long to fight with people, and now I just can't be asked. Occasionally I had somebody tell me one time this, in the general public, I was drinking diet soda. They go, drinking diet soda is worse for you than drinking regular soda.
Oh my God.
Yes, because the aspartame is worse for you than 200 calories of table sugar. Give me a break. And I just looked at her and said, you know what? I've studied nutrition and physiology for the last 2 decades. You read one article, you're wrong, I'm done. I didn't even debate it with her because I don't care. I really don't. I've occasionally had people, like I said, if people ask, I will give them the best information. I'll give them the references. I will give them the science to the best of my ability. And except for that, I don't care. So this is at age 46, I don't have the energy anymore. And Alan and I've discussed this with him. He wrote a piece for my website about Anaconda, which was an old something T-Nation did a bunch of years ago. And I go, dude, you're wasting your time. What you're going to do is drive more people to the website. Yeah. You can't fight it. You can't argue. Look at what happened with Food Babe, right? Food Babe was just spewing the most amazingly awful information. And every time she wrote a stupid article, everybody would post about it, about how dumb this was. Guess what? You're giving her free publicity. When Vice.com or whoever it was ran that article skewering her, she got 5 times more hits to her website than she was getting before. Whether she did that on purpose or not, I don't know. But that is a model that works. You say stuff that's so stupid that dumb people believe it, and I'm not just being mean, it's just that's reality. But the people who know better will do your publicity for you.
Yeah.
People who kept sharing that stuff, who kept skewering that stuff, were making it worse, in my opinion. Because another aspect of the human brain, controversy breeds interest, right? Every time in the US that they try to ban an album, it sells 10 times more. Every time you try to censor a movie, people want to see it. And every time someone online sees an article, well, if there's controversy, there must be something to it. Donald Trump, for those of you who are following the ridiculousness of the American political process, I don't know if he's doing it on purpose or not, but he is playing the game so well because the dumber the stuff he says, believe him more, and the people who think he's an idiot, all they do is talk about it.
Oh, yeah.
They're doing his work for him. So in my opinion, the best way to deal with that stuff is to simply ignore it and to provide better information so that when people want that better information, they can find it. And that's the approach that I take now.
Yeah.
I'm not interested in proselytizing or trying to change people's minds anymore. Once they've realized that all the other information is crap because it didn't work, then they come to me. Or they go to Alan, or they go to Eric, or they go to Brad, or they go to the people who are very scientifically evidence-based. And that's increasing. I think the percentage of people who want good information is increasing. I got into a big debate with Brad Schoenfeld about this. And he's just like, I really think it's changing. I go, no, dude, it's not. I go, you're seeing the people that come to your website. Bodybuilding.com, tnation.com gets 1,000 times as many views per day as I ever will. You could add up all the evidence-based fit pros in the industry, and there's a lot of us. And bodybuilding.com still gets 100 times as many views per day as us put together. General public is never going to come around.
Yeah, I like one
gradually increase the percentage.
Yeah, like one thing I will say though on, so yeah, like sometimes it is easy to fall for that though. Like some people like Peter Attia, I don't know if you follow his work.
A little bit,
but yeah, like I mean he kind of pushes the idea that I mean obviously maybe I'm strawmanning him a little bit, but basically he's revilifying carbs. More or less what it comes down to is that not overeating, but more so the types of nutrients that we are overeating, which are carbs mainly,
right,
that are the problem, but the way he presents it is incredibly compelling. Like he is an incredibly wise person.
Sure.
And if you listen to him, it's very, very easy to fall for that
and that's just it. It is very, Gary Taubes did a fantastic job of cherry picking his literature, right? It's hilarious that he says he spent 5 years of involved research, because he seems to have stopped at about the 1980. He was citing a 1912 medical book for the insulin thing. Like, basically, he came across the study that agreed with him, and he goes, well, he just stopped looking after that. He missed the point that study turned at what was, even the researchers who did that study later said that it was wrong. He realized that he had something, and he made a very compelling looking argument. Now, the problem I then have is, okay, people buy into it. Fantastic. The average person doesn't have the background to figure that out. My problem is that, okay, if I now present with you 50 studies that say that his studies are wrong, they will ignore those. That's the issue, right? And usually, there's typically an element of truth to what they're saying. There's always an element of truth to this. The people vilifying carbs are saying, well, people overeat carbs, what's his name? I can't remember. You probably will know. There's a guy online, and he talks very much about the reward aspect of food consumption, and he's written.
Stefan Guillenet?
Thank you. Yeah, that's who I'm thinking of. And he's not wrong. But, food drives reward, but everyone's focused on carbs. Everyone got on that, oh, sugar is just as bad as heroin. Oh, come on. What they don't realize is that eating is rewarding, right? It's not carb addiction. It's not food. It's eating addiction, because eating is very important to humans. They also miss the fact that dietary fat drives the same system. They also miss the fact that, the whole high fructose corn syrup, you've got Ludwig, you've got Taubes, you've got all those guys that are like, this is the most obesogenic substance in the world. And it's like, and they base that on correlations. In the 80s, obesity started going up. Well, guess what? 80 million other things were changing in our environment. They've now shown that sugar intake is going down, has since about the late 2000s. Obesity continues to go up. Well, boom, your correlation is now wrong. Sure, are sugars easy to overeat? Absolutely. They're sweet, they taste good, they're calorically dense. Liquids specifically are much easier to overeat than solids, right? And the issue is high fructose corn syrup is found in soda. Now, what I always tell people is, all right, fantastic. I'm not saying that's untrue. However, you ever known anyone who drank a lot of sugary soda who the rest of their diet wasn't appalling? Right? Go look at their grocery cart. Go look at what they're buying at the mini mart. They might be getting that soda with a bunch of high sugar, high fat junk food, right? Why are we focusing only on the sugar aspect? Most junk foods, or a grand majority of them anyway. Yeah, we've got pure sugar stuff. We've got Sweet Tarts and Smarties, and I know Smarties overseas are chocolate based. And, we've got stuff like that in the US. That's not what people eat. They get candy bars that are high sugar and high fat. Yes, soda is a problem, but to think that that's all that's going, I've never known someone who drank regular sugary soda who had the rest of their diet in order or wasn't inactive. So to focus on that singular reductive factor is asinine, right? So then they get into the insulin hypothesis. Well, sugar drives insulin, right? Well, fat can store itself by itself, so you're wrong about that in the first place. They're like, well, but if you get people to reduce their carbs, they lose weight, right? Because they eat less. Magic. We knew that in the 70s with the ketogenic diets. There's nothing magic to it other than they're eating less. It's not insulin. The recent Kevin Hall study, there's all this work that says it's not a matter of reducing insulin. It's a matter of reducing calories. Is removing concentrated sugars a way to do that? Sure. In the 80s, which probably before you were born, guess what? They found the same thing with dietary fat.
Yeah.
And if you reduce dietary fat, you eat less too. The problem is very low fat diets are frequently difficult to stick to, et cetera, et cetera. People ended up overeating anyway because what they heard, and you can find this on low carb forums all day, every day. What they've heard is, it's low carb, I can eat as much of it as I want. Because it's low carb, can't get fat without carbs. And then they go, why am I not losing weight? Well, maybe you're eating too much. No, calories don't count.
Yeah, that was me actually 2 years ago.
Sure, and I mean, it's an easy trap to fall into. And if there's a problem I have with a lot of mainstream diet books, it's that. They start with counting calories doesn't work. You don't have to reduce calories to lose weight. this is what makes you fat. Don't eat this, you'll lose weight. And you do until you end up eating more. The body adapts, hunger goes up, metabolism slows, and the food industry will introduce lots and lots and lots of either low fat, like we had by the time we had every low fat food in existence in the 80s, people were overeating. Guess what? The last low carb thing in the 90s, they had low carb jelly beans, low carb cookies, bars. If you go look at some of like the Atkins food bars at the store, they have like 3 net carbs, but they have as if not more calories than the carb-based bars. But people go, no carbs. Oh, nuts are no carbs. Bring it on. Paleo people are just nuts and nuts and nuts and nuts. Do you know how many calories are in that? Just as calorie concentrated as sugar.
Yeah.
So invariably, but once they've been programmed that all that matters is insulin, or all that matters is not eating X nutrient, it works for a while, and the long-term studies show that in the long term, low carb, it's maybe a kilo difference. It's maybe 2.5 pounds. And the low carb guys are like, see, it's superior. Give me a break. 2 pounds?
Yeah.
That's noise.
Yeah.
That's not even relevant.
And actually, the funny thing is that brings to mind that I have a different YouTube channel where I just kind of put up videos that I gathered from like podcasts and stuff, like little quotes and stuff. And the most views, the one video that got the most views is an interview where Jonathan Baylor, author of the Calorie Myth book, asks Gary Taubes, so what would happen if someone was to drink 10,000 calories of butter? Are you saying that person would not gain fat? And Gary says like, well, yeah, I'm sure they would actually gain some fat eventually, but no one's going to do that. So,
which is not an answer. Like that's him.
That's not an answer.
Dodging the question, because like I said, originally it was insulin. And not calories. And he actually, so this is where he came up with that. So in 1980, George Bray did a study and they looked at food intake in lean people and obese people. And the study suggested that the lean and the obese eat the same number of calories. Okay. About 5 or 10 years later, they would do more research and realize that no, lean and obese say they eat the same number of calories. And these are very different things, because we know now after 30 years of literature, people are terrible at estimating their calorie intake. People can misestimate by anywhere from 30 to 70%. So a lot of people, and the obese tend to underrepresent or underreport fat intake, an odd blip. I'm not saying they're actively lying. I don't want anybody to hear that this is see, fat people are slothful and gluttonous. That's not what I'm saying. People suck at this. Registered dietitians are bad at this. And if anyone should be good at it, it should be them. An odd little data point is lean fit people frequently report eating a lot healthier than they really do. They probably do it deliberately. I would suggest that if anyone's lying, it's the leaner and the fitter people, because they don't want people to see what they're really eating. So they misrepresent their food intake by they don't talk about the weekend carbo, sugar, sweet, junk food binges. They don't talk about that either, but they do it consciously. Regardless, George Bray, they realized that, look, the obese do eat more. They simply are underreporting it. And there's been tons of fun little TV things, right? They go to the man on the street. How many calories are in an entire pizza? And people go, I don't know, 800? Okay, that's a slice. That's maybe 2 slices. This pizza has 3,000 calories. This is 12,000 kilojoules. You've seen the stuff where some woman's like, I have a slow metabolism. I don't eat much at all. And they add it up and she's eating, 15,000 calories a day. She's eating 4 bags of potato chips crisp. She's eating a bunch of chocolate, bunch of all this stuff, but people don't realize it, or they're deluding themselves or whatever. Well, Gary Taubes saw that study and he says, if the obese don't eat more than the lean, there must be another cause, insulin. And then, of course, he just ran with that, because apparently he didn't read anything after 1980. Because if he had, he would have realized that data set was wrong. It was completely flawed. George Bray, like I said, they came out later and was like, you know what? We screwed up. We were totally wrong about that. And we know now that. But anyways, so first it was insulin. And Gary Taubes has also been on record saying is exercise doesn't work because it makes you hungrier, which is contextually true. However, the number of calories you to eat above normal is still less than the calories you burn during exercise, right? The net effect is still a negative, right? So if you burn 600 calories in exercise, you might eat 200 more. Well, guess what? You're still 400 in the hole. He's gone on record as saying exercise is ineffective, despite all the data that says he's especially for weight maintenance. He's completely wrong about that. As soon as it was clear that the insulin hypothesis failed, then he switched it very subtly. He says, well, yes, it's calories. However, all calorie-restricted diets are carb-restricted diets and lower insulin. So it's still insulin. Like, it's just watching him dodge this. And then, of course, we've got the recent Kevin Hall study that, I mean, meticulously controlled. Looked at high carb, low fat, high fat, low carb, measured insulin, measured all of this. And high carb, low fat, and I'm not saying it's inherently superior. I'm just saying that when they measured it under super controlled conditions, there was no difference. Low carb guys also seem incapable of realizing that low carb and high protein are not synonyms, because the studies they love to cite don't match protein intake. Higher protein is superior to lower protein. This is not debatable. But they seem to think that if there's a benefit to low carbs, that the average person ends up eating more protein, because you have to. Well, guess what? I can eat high protein or higher protein and still eat carbs. A high carb diet is not the equivalent of a low protein diet, unless it's a certain, like 80% carbs, which I've seen some people do.
Yeah.
Low carb, but they can't seem to make that distinction that a protein match, that if the protein's not matched, the studies aren't valid, because you're comparing at least 3 variables. Protein, carbs, and fat are all different, but they are like, well, see, it's low carb. Well, it's also higher fat. It's also lower protein. Right. So Kevin Hall's study, and I've even seen low carb zealots go, well, actually, metabolic ward studies, right, where it's controlled and they control every calorie, are less valid than real world. What? How can just like the cognitive dissonance and the desire to maintain that ideology is just amazing. And don't get me wrong, low carb diets are often better for people with insulin resistance. Very low fat diets tend to leave people hungrier, not debating that. For a lot of people, reducing carbs does lower their calorie intake, increasing protein keeps them fuller, moderate fat diets I'm not debating that low carb diets have their benefit. Hell, my first book was about ketogenic diets, but I even took the stance of, here are the pros and cons. They are completely appropriate in some situations. They're completely inappropriate. Adherence, which kind of ties us back to where we started, long-term adherence is the key. It always has been. The diets are really, within a range, are basically about the same. That's what the long-term studies show. It just doesn't matter. The best diet is the one you can stick to in the long term. And if a lower carb or a low carb diet is better for your long-term adherence, I'm all for it. Make no mistake. It's just this insistence that carbs are the problem, that carbs are the only problem, that insulin is that's the issue, because I think it's misleading people. It's leading people down a bad road and making them think that, because I actually did, it's funny you mentioned that, as at a restaurant when Good Calories, Bad Calories first came out, and someone actually said that eating a pound of butter, God, what did he say? He was arguing with his girlfriend or wife or something. And he actually did make a comment to something about you could eat an entire stick of butter and you would engage. I'm just like, oh, God. And stuff like that really bothers me, because it so confuses the general public. Because like you said, compelling arguments, how do they know? How do they know what's valid or not, when everything they're hearing is completely different? Well,
one thing that it actually makes it very difficult to judge for people is when people like Taubes or John Kiefer, I don't know if you're familiar with his work.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So they will say something, for example, I don't know, something about insulin, and they will cite a reference, but the reference will not be a metabolic ward study or something. It will be like, whatever transgenase phosphorylase, whatever does this in the cellular level, how is the average person going to judge whether that's correct or not? They will just say, whoa, that looks
And as frequently as not, when you actually go look at the paper, like it either has nothing to do with the claim, or I've seen in many cases, like the abstracts are often very misleading. And if you read the full paper, it actually says, like you read the discussion, and it says the exact opposite of what they think it says. But they know that there's about 14 people on the internet, and or however many like me, who I'll go pull the full paper because I want to see what it says. And you go look at it, that's not what this paper says. And you point that out to them, and they just get defensive and dodge around it. Kiefer, when the carb backloading thing, when it basically came out that everything he said was basically nonsense, he actually had the arrogance to say, well, I'm still right for the researchers to catch up with me. And it's like, dude, you can't have it both ways. You can't say science, 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 and go, you know what, actually all your science is BS. You go, well, science doesn't have all the answers, which is the game that a lot of people play.
Oh, yeah.
I see that a lot, or you can find a study to prove anything. Well, that's not how science works. But yeah, you see a lot of that. And, in the fitness industry, usually that sort of claims are predicated on, well, I'm in shape. Or, of course, my favorite, I have a PhD. No names need to be mentioned. I've had an idea that came through a few years ago I was highly critical of. And I cited all the papers. I cited all the research. And they were dismissed because, well, Lyle doesn't do research. Oh, screw you. Like I said, we don't need to get into that particular thing. But you get people that are claiming to use science, but it's only when it suits them.
Yeah.
And you cannot have it both ways. I even try most of the time, studies do frequently contradict each other. And it's usually because they're looking at slightly different things. The models are different. And people don't realize that the way science works is one study is meaningless. Two studies is still like you have to replicate the results, preferably from an independent lab. And eventually you get enough research on a topic that goes, okay, we can build a pretty good model about this. Which isn't to say it won't change. But a paper comes out, and this is a problem with general popular science reporting. Every new paper says something different. And people go, you know what? Last year butter was bad. This year butter is good. Eggs were bad. Eggs are good. I give up. Right? Every time. As my grandmother used to say, everything's going to kill you. You pick your poison. The WHO thing, processed meats are bad. Right. Look at people who eat a lot of processed meats. Their diet is terrible. Like they don't, fly, and you can't, in the same way you can't reduce obesity to one factor, you can't reduce health to one factor. There's, but people want an enemy. It makes for good clickbait topics. And, by the time you've got 10 studies and 9 of them say one thing and then there's one outlier, okay, something was weird about that, not dismissing it, not saying it's wrong, but if you put them together, you look at them side by side and you go, well, these 5 that said this looked at this particular group. An example, years ago, there was some debate over, did metabolic adaptation happen, right? Did the body adapt metabolically to weight loss? About half the paper said yes, about half the paper said no. And if you actually group them, the half that said no were in extremely obese people, right? When you're going from 50 to 45% body fat, the body doesn't need to adapt. But if you're going from 30 to 25% body fat, it does. That was the division. It wasn't that it doesn't happen. It doesn't happen till a certain point. You build a full model from the majority of the papers, right? One of the papers Kiefer cited was, insulin resistance is lower in the evening. Well, in diabetics under certain conditions. Well, 2 other papers said it's worse in the morning. But when you cite a single study, it's very easy to draw a simplistic model. And we're not diabetics. We're talking training impacts on this, diet impacts on this. But that's unfortunately become kind of the nature of the industry. And I'll be honest, that to a great degree, you can probably blame me for a lot of that. Right? It was starting to happen in the magazines in the 90s. Muscle Media 2000, it's one of the first magazines I remember that really was looking at studies. But when I got out of college in 1995 or 1993, and I got online in 1995-ish, I was on this news group called Misc Fitness Weights, right? And I was fresh out of college, just gung-ho. I was going to change the world. And I was really one of the first people who was pushing, going, you know what? You can talk about meal frequency all you want. Here's what the research actually says. And you're wrong. You don't have to eat 6 meals a day to stoke the metabolism. Skipping a meal does not create them. Like, the old ideas are wrong. And I was I think one of the first people who really was pushing that evidence-based thing through, going, look, this is what the science actually says. And I'm fantastic that 30 years of empirical evidence has found this, but a lot of places it's right. A lot of places, bro science is turning out to be correct.
Yeah.
You let guys experiment for 30 years, but then you get into the drug issue, you get into so much that came out of bodybuilding drug culture, and that changes everything. But I was really one of the first ones pushing that. Now if you don't have research, you can't be correct. And now we're getting to the point that, God, everyone's got a PhD but me. I'm like, is this where we're going to get to? That if you haven't published science, you don't get if you haven't published a study, you've got Brad Schoenfeld, Brett Contreras, Lane Norton. I don't know if Alan Aragon has gone back to school, but you've got a lot of guys now that are publishing studies. And It's like, I think you can partially blame me for that, but for good or for bad. Go ahead.
Just before, so I wanted to track back for a second because we were really geeking out on fats and carbs, which is one of your big topics that you're commonly asked about. So since we're talking about new research and stuff, one exciting stuff that came out in recent years that I wanted to ask you about is, Jake Wilson in Tampa did some interesting stuff on ketogenic diet and bodybuilding. But regardless, one thing that came out in recent years that interested me is that how carbs for natural lifters, kind of just doing traditional bodybuilding, as far as glycogen is concerned, and insulin doesn't seem to be this amazingly huge player in muscle building. Insulin within the normal physiological ranges, and because glycogen resynthesis is so efficient, it's not that much of a concern. What are your thoughts on carbs?
This is something actually, Eric and I have been discussing. Right, so you look back, and for years when they looked at around workout nutrition, it was A, for endurance athletes, and B, glycogen resynthesis was really the priority, because endurance athletes doing 4 hours a day are burning a ton of glycogen that they have to refill. Some studies came out, that protein plus carbs was better. We had the idea of this anabolic window, and the general idea was that amino acids stimulated protein synthesis. Carbs stimulated insulin, which inhibited protein breakdown. Actually, hang on 1 second.
All right.
Come on, outside.
Maybe in the meanwhile, I should throw a show to the viewers here.
And kind of in recent years, some of that has come into question. It looks like, A, protein may raise insulin enough to have a maximal effect. Adding carbs may not have a benefit from sort of a strict muscle growth standpoint. And there's kind of two different issues. A is optimizing muscle growth, the post-recovery period. And then there's also the glycogen resynthesis aspect of it. And a lot of that, I think, comes down to how much training you're doing, how much volume you're doing. Back when you had guys in the 70s doing 20 sets per body part, that depletes a lot of muscle glycogen. If you've got a natural lifter doing, say, 6 to 8 sets of 8 to 10 repetitions or in that range, it's probably not depleting a stunning amount. And even if it were, right, even that rapid glycogen resynthesis thing, it's really only truly critical. If you've got an athlete training twice a day, right? They're doing a hard workout in the morning. They're doing a hard workout 6 hours later. They have 6 hours to recover, refill, to be ready to train.
Yeah.
That is a very different situation than someone who's training once a day or once every other day or a couple days on, 1 day off. When you've got 24 hours, this idea that you have to get this super rapid refilling of muscle glycogen, it's really not as important. So Eric and I have been discussing this because I'm actually on the Around Workout Nutrition chapter of the woman's book. And he's kind of the opinion that until workouts get to, maybe 90 minutes, and I would say predominantly bodybuilding work, right? If you're doing powerlifting work, Olympic lifting in that 3 to 5 rep range, you're mainly ATP, CP pathway, that really short end. You're not using a lot of carbohydrate. Until you're really doing a high volume of training, you probably don't need a lot of, you don't need 100 grams of carbs after training. You may not need any, I still, I'm hedging my bets. There's still some work that suggests it may have an addition, but you don't need a ton. If you want to do 25, 30 grams of protein and 25, 30 grams of carbs post-workout, carbs won't hurt you. Are they required in the strictest sense? Probably not. And if you're on even moderate carbs, you're going to refill muscle glycogen. Most bodybuilders are alternating body parts anyway. So if you train upper body twice a week, you've got 3 days to refill upper body muscle glycogen. If you're training, and if you're training more frequently than that, you're probably doing less volume per workout, right? I know there's a trend towards training body parts more frequently than previously. Yeah. If you're doing that, though, you're not doing as many sets per workout, generally speaking. So if you're doing 3 hard sets, the amount of glycogen depletion is just minuscule. And if you're eating moderate carbs for the next 24 hours, you're going to refill that. So yeah, I think there seems to be a shift in that, away from needing super excessive carbs immediately after training. I mean, even the anabolic window, Alan Aragon did a really good review on that topic. And outside of a couple of very context-specific situations, it's at best a small effect. Like generally, really, your overall day's eating, that you hit your protein goals, your carb goals, your calorie goals, that's really the primary factor. Around workout nutrition can have benefits, right? Like if you train first thing in the morning, let's say you got to get up at 6, you're in the gym at 7, you don't have time to eat, or you know that if you eat something, you're going to be sick at your stomach, right? That's a place where I think post-workout nutrition, critical.
Yeah.
Because you haven't eaten anything. And a lot of the early studies looking at this topic were fasted. I think that's part of what, because it's an easier to control, but if you've eaten 4 hours before your workout, even a moderate sized meal, 400 or 500 calories, mixed macronutrients, carbs, protein, fats, and fiber, it's still digesting. You are still getting aminos and carbs released into the bloodstream.
Yeah.
If you've gone, let's say you ate lunch at 12, you're not training till 6, you might benefit from a small amount of carbs and protein before that workout, just because that last meal is probably almost done digesting. Your blood sugar may be a little bit low. Very individual. Some people, we've got the intermittent fasting group. Some people are fine training on an empty stomach. They're typically doing very low volume training, right? They go in, they're hitting 3 heavy sets, handful of body parts. That's very different than being in the gym for 90 minutes. In that case, you might want to have a small snack an hour before, a small protein bar. It doesn't even need to be much. Some people don't train well with solid food in their stomach. Some people don't train well with liquids in their stomach. If you're doing high reps on short rest, very metabolically stressful, that'll make you throw up under the best conditions. You may not want anything in your stomach. So a lot of this is kind of very context dependent, but I think, yeah, in general, this idea that you must eat carbs and protein as soon as possible or your muscles will fall off is incorrect.
Would you say that for like the average person, let's say training 5 days a week, so fairly high volume, but natural lifter, not doing anything crazy, would you say low carb still might be a bad choice for them? But would you say that
yes,
that it's a bad argument, that it is a bad choice because of glycogen and insulin? Would you say that that's not really a concern for these people?
I think that's part of it. There have been a couple of studies that muscle glycogen impacts on gene expression for muscle growth. I think 1 or 2 have said that it matters. 1 said that it didn't. Like I do think, being depleted, and that is another situation. If you're chronically depleted of muscle glycogen, that's very different than eating a moderate carb diet. And in that case, carbs may be beneficial. The research on that is kind of all over the map. Some of it says if you're on a low carb diet, some of it says it doesn't hurt strength performance. They typically test like 3 sets. If you're doing a 90-minute workout and you're on less than 100 grams of carbs a day, and maybe we should defining terms is key. Low carb means different things to different people. To a traditionally trained dietitian who thinks everyone should eat 65% carbs, 40% carbs is low carbs. Well, that's still pretty high if your calories are high. Low carb diets traditionally refer to, 100 to 150 grams per day or less. That's, so we're looking at, a lot of it needs to define terms. I think if you're on moderate carbs, 30 to 40%, don't worry about it. If you're on like a ketogenic diet, less than 100 grams of carbs per day, I think that can eventually get limiting. But even then, what if you do a weekend carb load, right? That's the old cyclical ketogenic diet. That was Body Opus. That was the anabolic diet. The ultimate diet has elements of that, where if you are doing 2 days a weekend where you are refilling muscle glycogen, that will probably get you through the week.
Yeah.
So so now are we doing a long-term ketogenic diet, long-term low carbs? Are we doing, a carbo load every 3 or 4 days, or 2 days out of every 7? You start getting into more complex schemes. I do think there's other disadvantages of strict low carb diets. Insulin is low. Testosterone binds to sex hormone binding globulin. You may have less free testosterone. Cortisol will probably be a little bit higher than it otherwise would. IGF-1, in that it matters. There's some hormonal changes that occur that I don't think are optimal for growth. At the same time, if you're doing moderate volume training, you sure don't need 60% carbs, right? Again, if you're an endurance athlete doing 4 hours a day, no debate. You need 10 to 12 grams per kilo per day. If you're a bodybuilder, unless you're doing super high reps and super high volume, I did the math in a couple of my books. Like, to deplete muscle glycogen about 70% from normal, you have to do it's about 12 sets of 20 per body part. It's a lot of volume, right? That's 240 total reps. So unless you're doing 24 sets of 10 per body part, you're going to be okay.
Okay, so I definitely wanted to ask you about fats, because I never really heard anyone say a definitive number on how much fat we really need, a real good definitive number on this.
Yeah, some of it depends on how you define need, right? From a strictly survival standpoint, you need that small amount of essential fatty acids. That's a few grams per day. Like, that would define the realistic lower limit. Clearly, that's unrealistic for the long term. Back in the 80s, people did like 10% fat diets. It was like 10 or 15 grams a day. That's usually not sustainable. They also had a lot of other things going on. A research set of studies that gets brought up a lot is studies showing that very low fat diets, like 20%, can decrease testosterone levels slightly compared to a 40% diet. Unfortunately, that's all they ever compare. They also compare low fat, high fiber to high fat, low fiber. So already you've got two variables. Is it the fiber? Is it the fat? Is it the combination? And they're really interested in health. They've actually done the same work in women. And the same low fat, high fiber diet tends to lower estrogen, which is good from a breast cancer standpoint. It may not be good from a menstrual cycle health standpoint. It may not be good from a performance standpoint, right? Low fat diets can deplete intramuscular triglycerides, type of fat found in the muscle, contributes to fullness, probably more important for endurance athletes. Very low fat diets can impair immune system function. Most of this work is endurance athletes. So the answer is, I don't think anyone knows what's optimal. Back in the day, Dan Duchesne, who was a very cutting-edge nutritionist, who's a friend of mine, who unfortunately passed away, he believed that moderate fat diets, 25 to 30%, yielded better growth. He was focusing a lot on, right, if you eat lots of carbs all the time, your body becomes very much carb reliant, right? That's the whole fat adaptation thing. The more carbs you eat, the less fat you burn. What that means is that if blood sugar drops, the body has to find carbs somewhere. Carbs aren't available. It may break down protein, right? You can get into a little bit of a situation if you're too much of a carb burner, I guess, where how well you're using protein might go down. Maybe, maybe not. So he was a big fan of like 30% fat diets. I find a lot of people rebel. I'm like, that's pretty high fat. I don't want to get fat. Not that fat per se makes you any fatter than carbs per se. Again, Eric and I have discussed this extensively. And unfortunately, most studies use percentages. And I detest percentages because I don't think it's physiologically relevant. So people ask me the question, and the number that I typically throw out is, hang on, I got to make sure I get the units right.
Drum roll.
Well, it's just I want to make sure I get the metric units correct. So the numbers I've thrown out, and Eric and I are kind of in agreement of this, is 0.44 grams per pound of body weight, right? So for a 180-pound lifter, that would be 80 grams of fat, right? And across 4 to 5 meals, that's still pretty moderate. Converting to kilos, let's see, multiply by 2.2, which would be 0.97 grams per kilo. Let me make sure I did that right.
So it was 0.4 per pound, right?
About 0.4 per pound, or the way he approaches it is 25% of total calories, but no less than 0.44 per pound. And that there are exceptions when you get to like the extremes of contest dieting. You may not have the calories to work with, right? When calories gets to beyond a certain point, if you're trying to keep carbs higher, fat may have to go below that. But I think as a good general number, that'll put most people in the right range. So 160-pound lifter, 40 grams of fat. 130-pound female, you're looking at 30 to 40 grams. I might bump that up slightly. 30 to with maybe a lower limit of 30 to 40 grams. That diet's just become awful if fat intake provides more food variability, taste, texture, keeps food in the stomach longer. It's moderate without being too high. So I think that's a good starting place.
And that 0.4 grams, is that or 4 per well? So that number that you just said, is that based on epidemiological observation or?
No, it's actually, I'm faking it. All I did is I just back calculated it. So I assumed a rough maintenance of say 16 calories per pound. That's a rough average. Yeah. I took 25% of that, which gives you 4 calories per pound of fat. Mm-hmm. Divide by 9, you get 0.4. It's based on exactly nothing. It's based on back calculating it to your average maintenance calories.
Okay, so it basically comes down to putting in a reasonably balanced ratio for fats and carbs.
Basically, yeah. I wish there were better numbers. I wish there was harder information on this. And if you look at the studies that have used the 20 and 40% or whatever, it's in that range, right? They're typically using a maintenance intake of like 1.7 multiplier on about 10 calories per pound. So like it's usually in that range. Like there's a paper on women that looked at, it was like 16% fat versus like 30% fat. And it was right in that range. It's like 30 grams of dietary fat versus about 50, which for their body weight. This is all a bit of an estimate, unfortunately. It just hasn't been effectively studied. Like they know in endurance athletes you need at least like 25% fat to refill it, but they just keep using percentages. So you kind of have to get in the studies, see what the maintenance levels are, back calculate it, and it just kind of ends up being, okay, the studies go, 20% versus 40%. Where's the cutoff? They've never looked at a middle ground to go, okay, would 20 versus 30% be different? Because they're looking at 40% fat, which is kind of the modern Western diet, versus 20%, which is a pretty low-fat diet. And going, let's compare these to make sure. But no one, to my knowledge, has really looked at anything in the middle. So maybe it's 30%, maybe 25. I'm trying to hedge my bets between a balanced diet, allowing enough carbs for training, allowing enough room for protein, and keeping calories where they need to be. So it's very much back calculated.
Okay.
But Eric agreed, so therefore we're right.
Okay, fair enough. And I have 2 more questions on fats, but we are already gone past an hour. I want to be respectful of your time.
No, I'm good.
Cool. All right, then.
I got nothing.
Cool. Then, one thing that I wanted to ask is, often I hear that from certain people, but I've never seen any evidence presented for this, but they say that when you're bulking, so you're in a caloric surplus, then it's wise to limit fat intake to a moderate amount and not go too high, because fats are energetically very efficiently converted into fat deposits on the body. So is there any scientific basis for this?
Yes and no. So we know that just based on biochemical pathways, right? Dietary fat is basically stored directly. It's stored very efficiently as fat. And in the 80s, part of the problem was they found that carbs, it used to be that, if you eat too many carbs, they are converted to fat and stored. That's what happens in animals. Doesn't happen in humans under most conditions. There's a couple weird ones. If you eat like 900 grams of carbs per day, every day for several days, you'll refill muscle glycogen and you get, but for the most part, carbs don't convert to fat. So they would, everybody heard in the 80s, carbs can't make you fat. Well, that's untrue. Carbs cause fat gain indirectly, right? This has to do, there's a hierarchy of how the body uses nutrients, right? So if you eat excess carbs, your body burns more carbs.
Yeah.
If you eat excess fat, your body does not burn more fat, right? The misconception among the high fat people is that eating more fat makes you burn more fat. That's incorrect. Eating less carbs makes you burn more fat. So if you eat more carbs, you burn more carbs. If you eat less carbs, you burn less carbs. Protein tends to control itself. Like carbs are kind of protein sparing, but so is fat, ketones, not getting into that. So if carbs come down, fat oxidation will go up. And if carbs go up, fat oxidation, the burning of fat for energy will go down, which means that any fat you are eating will get stored. So a couple early studies said fat was more fattening. A couple later studies said no, it actually for the same amount of overfeeding, they're equivalent. Now the confound is, of course, they weren't training. When you train and deplete muscle glycogen, incoming carbs tend to go to glycogen first. They get stored for later use and then burned for energy second, right? Mm-hmm. Ultimate Diet 2 uses that as a trick, right? You deplete muscle glycogen, then that first day you actually eat about double maintenance of carbs, but you don't get fat because the incoming carbs go to muscle, get stored first, burned second. So I think there's some logic to it. Then again, people have found that for the most part, it kind of doesn't matter. Like if you're bulking, okay, you lower dietary fat. Like let's say you're at maintenance, right? You're eating this amount of carbs and this amount of fat. Well, you're burning about this amount of carbs, you're burning about this amount of fat. Body composition stays stable. Okay, you start bulking. You raise fat, you're still burning the same amount of carbs. You're still burning the same amount of fat. The difference gets stored. Let's say you raise carbs and lower fat. Well, you're burning this many carbs, which means you're burning probably the same amount of fat you were, or hang on, I did that wrong. Carb oxidation will go down further. All the fat you're eating gets stored. So yeah, but then again, you add training. Some of those carbs may go into muscle. I think keeping dietary fat moderated, certainly when bulking, again, in the long term, it kind of may not matter. People get just as fat on high carb, low fat diets, or seem to, as they do keeping carbs lower. So I think within a range. I think if people are getting fat when they're bulking, the problem is they're just eating too damn much, and that gets a whole different issue, and which I'll just touch on briefly. Muscle growth is not fast, especially in naturals. Right, a beginner, if he's lucky, might gain 20 to 25 pounds a year. Intermediate, 10 to 12 pounds. Advanced, 3 to 5 pounds. Talk to the guys like Eric Helms or the more advanced bodybuilders. They're fighting to gain a pound a year or 2 pounds a year. Now, if you look at the actual math of what it takes to gain a pound, right, so let's say you're gaining 2 pounds a month. Let's be very optimistic. To gain a pound of muscle takes, just to make them, we'll call it 3,000 calories above maintenance, just to keep it simple. It's closer to 2,700. It's in that range. So if you're gaining 2 pounds a month and it's 2,700 calories per pound, that's a total surplus of 5,400 calories. You divide that by 30, that means your total surplus needs to be 200 calories a day.
Yeah.
Over maintenance. That's nothing, right? And even if you cluster that to your workout, it's still only like 200 to 300 calories over maintenance. What do people do when they bulk? Bro, 1,000 calories over maintenance. Well, that's why they got fat. And you can't force feed muscle. You can't force feed muscle growth. There's actually a really good study by a researcher named Garth over in Not America. That's the best I can do. She's actually doing some really good work with elite athletes, looking at body composition changes and dieting. And that doesn't get done very often. And they did a study where they looked at a nutritional intervention where they gave them a very specific number of calories above maintenance to eat. And they looked at a group that was just allowed to go for it. What they found is that both groups gained about the same amount of muscle over that time period. The group that just got to eat as much as they want gained something like 4 times as much fat as the first group. So muscle growth is unfortunately very limited and very slow. And if you look at it for by the time you get to 1 pound a month, 2,700 calories per month, you're looking at just under 100 calories a day surplus. That's nothing. That's an apple. Like, that's not even measurable. If you're down to that super advanced guy gaining a pound a year, the surplus you need is minuscule. And I've seen guys make this mistake. They're very close to their genetic limits. They don't want to believe it, and they're like, I'm going to bulk up to 300. Okay, dude. Here's what's going to happen. You're going to get to 300. You're going to be fat. It's going to take you 2 years to diet, and you're going to end up at exactly the same place you started.
Yeah, I think
this doesn't work.
Yeah, and I think perhaps why the whole notion of like limiting dietary fat a lot while bulking came out to be is because when you're eating a highly energetically dense macronutrient like fat, then it makes it a lot easier to just do a dreamer bulk. Like,
absolutely, very much so. And that's the danger. Again, that's very context specific. Whether dietary fat or carbs are more satiating, but neither here nor there. For a lean athlete, dietary fat is very highly concentrated. 100 calories, that's 10 grams of fat. That's less than a tablespoon of peanut butter, which is the favorite fat of the physique competitor.
Which I don't get why, because I can eat a jar of that. Like, I cannot think of anything more hyper palatable than that.
No, I don't know why that's so popular. That's become an all-time favorite dieting snack, and it gets a lot of people into trouble for a different reason, right? If you actually look at a tablespoon, it's the level's actually just below the lip. Right, you get small females, and they get that big packed tablespoon. Mm-hmm. Right, already they've added 50 to 60%. They do that. They of course lick the back of the spoon. That doesn't count, right? It's not in the spoon. Yeah. And suddenly their diet stopped working because they're doing that 4 times a day. Well, guess what? You're eating 400 calories more than you thought. That gets back to the misestimation thing. Yeah, I don't know why peanut butter is so popular. It may very well be your next question. Is in terms of the type of dietary fat, if that matters at all. Just quickly, there is 3 primary types of dietary fats. Saturated fats, which are found predominantly in animal products, solid at room temperature. In general, unsaturated fatty acids, which are generally liquids found in vegetable source foods. There's monounsaturated fats such as olive oil, and then there's the polyunsaturated fats, which includes the omega-3 fatty acids, omega-6, and the essential fatty acids, and the fish oils. Fish oil should be part of everyone's diet, whether they eat fatty fish, which is very cultural. In America, we don't do a lot of that, but I know some cultures are just kind of raised on eating that stuff. That has to be part of everybody's diet. And I recommend an intake of between 1.8 and 3 total grams of EPA DHA. I don't care about the ratios. Most fish oil or fish oil products have a mixture of it. And that's total. So like my fish oils have 300 milligrams of combined EPA and DHA, the 2 fish oils. So I would take between 6 and 10 capsules to get 1.8, 6 times 300 to 3 grams, 10 times 300. So you just have to look at the label. That should be part of everyone's diet. The effects on inflammation, potentially fat gain, that's kind of debatable. They do everything, and they're very deficient in the modern diet. Unsaturated fats tend to be kind of second, and then saturated fats, have gotten really the big bad health rap. For a lean athlete who's eating generally well and training, and it's not an issue. Some of that, the dietary fat testosterone data suggested that saturated fat had an independent effect. There was one weird study, you've probably seen it, where they gave them either high saturated fat or high unsaturated fat muffins. It was something like this. And the unsaturated fat muffins caused less fat gain and more lean body mass. I don't know if it's a valid finding. I don't know that it's ever been, I don't think it's been replicated. There's a weird subculture that thinks that unsaturated fatty acids are less healthy because they can oxidize and all this stuff. Never mind that every study in the history of ever says it's the opposite. Most people are going to get a mix. Unless you eliminate every animal product, you're going to get some saturated fatty acids. You're going to get some unsaturated fatty acids. I don't know that it matters in the big scheme, but I think that's part of why the peanut butter is an unsaturated fatty acid predominantly. I suspect it came out of a feeling that it was generally healthier. Again, for lean athletes, it doesn't matter. If you're eating vegetables and fruits and lean protein and active, like for the general person who's obese and active, too much sugar, stress, smoking, alcohol, saturated fats make a big difference. For lean athletes, don't worry about it. So
yeah, actually, just because you mentioned the anabolic properties of fish oils and stuff, just as an offhand note, have you seen that guy called Brian Paskin doing because he published these kind of fear mongering type of stuff about fish oils and like how fish oil can be easily oxidized and causes inflammation and all that stuff, but I assume that was more of an issue with the fish oil capsules more so than the fish oil.
Yeah, well, the inflammation thing is exactly wrong. It's the exact opposite. It modulates inflammation. Yes, the fish oils are more chemically reactive, to be sure. They react to light. They react to oxygen. That's why they're always sold in opaque bottles. Refrigeration, they shouldn't be left out in the heat. Ray Peat is another one who's just like polyunsaturated fatty acids are the devil. And of course, he pulls some really interesting papers to support that. And yeah, excess amounts, no doubt. A lot of fish oil products have vitamin E in them, which actually helps to prevent their oxidation. But that's why, like, you need some. A lot of people find that if they like break the fish oil capsule open or the liquid kind of has a bitter taste, it may have gone rancid. I recommend just keep them refrigerated, open the bottle, take yours out, take them. If you could potentially take some vitamin E with it, but I wouldn't worry about it too much. So yeah, I see where he's going with that, but I think unless you are leaving a clear bottle of liquid fish oil in the sun, I don't think it's a big issue. Certainly not as much as I don't think it's worth fear mongering over, to be sure.
All right, then.
But that's one of those things like we talked about. There's an element of truth to it, but you can take an element of truth and blow it completely out of proportion like that.
All right. Real quickly, what do you think about the big testosterone debate, like within the natural or within normal physiological ranges? So I'm not talking about like subclinical to a normal level, but like from 600 to 700 or something like that. Do you think that makes any difference for a natural lifter?
If it is, I think it's very small. But the only data comes from actually some steroid injection studies that Basin did that were extremely tightly controlled, where there might be some small differences. I don't know how much. I think even if you look at the dietary fat studies, I don't even think the effect's that large. Like it might be from like 400 to 440, which might have a tiny effect. If you take someone from 300, which is just above hypogonadal, to 900, all the difference in the world. Like if you triple testosterone, that will make all the difference in the world. And it's worth, even a baby dose of anabolic steroids can like triple levels. Like it can take you from 900 to something like 2,700. Like that's why steroids work, and they're kind of awesome. I personally think that worrying about all of that within the natural range, I don't think it will amount to a tremendous amount. Like I think even in Basin studies, like 100 milligrams difference, it was like maybe a kilo of muscle. Like it was maybe a couple of pounds difference or lean body mass when they actually, because they measured it. So yeah, it won't hurt, but I don't think it's going to have the effects people want. People want it to be steroid-like. And the only thing that's steroid-like is steroids. And they work, stunningly. That 600 milligram study by Basin, with not even training, they put on 10 kilos of lean body mass, and it was shown to be at least somewhat. Their strength went up. It was shown, myonuclei increased. There was muscle fiber increases. It wasn't just water retention. And 600 milligrams per week is a baby dose. Guys are taking a gram a day, and getting very much off topic, but like steroids have steroid-like effects. I think small changes never hurts. But these guys who are at 400 are like, yep, gonna optimize this and that. Like, wow, you're at 450. Hooray! I got news for you. Go be a cyclist, because you're always gonna suck at this. And there's just no getting around it. If you look at successful bodybuilders, if you look at some of the guys in Wilson's study, they were slightly above the normal. You had guys that were in like the 1,000 to 1,100 range. They were definitely at very much the high end of normal.
Right.
So whatever results he claimed to have gotten, and I say claimed because I think his results are impossible. Every study he did generated results that have never been seen before or after, with or without drugs. But regardless, his guys were all in the upper echelon of genetic hyperresponders. And the realities of the normal curve, the average person, like even that number I gave, that 20 to 25 pounds of muscle, that's a maximum. Most people probably won't even get that. Way after you look at the fat-free mass index, and I see people arguing all the time, well, that's not an upper limit. I can name 6 guys that are above it. Fantastic. Now let's look at the 90,000 hard training bodybuilders that will never come in above 165 in contest shape. Right? I don't care that a handful of genetic outliers or genetic superiors can hit that level. The reality is you're never going to, so get over it. Like, it's always guys that are $150 going, yeah, you can get to 220 naturally. Yeah, some guys can, but you're not going to. So you better come to terms with that.
Yeah.
I think that goes back to some of the other stuff we talked about, as far as you see these big guys going, yep, I'm eating 500 calories over maintenance. Well, if you're on anabolics and synthesizing muscle 24/7 at double or triple the rate of the natural, absolutely you can do that. You add a little clen, thyroid, GH, you can do it without getting fat. Naturals bulk like that, they get fat really, really, really quickly. And unfortunately, small surpluses are really hard to measure. They're really, like you said, you start to eat certain foods, man, and, I need that pint of ice cream at bedtime. Bulking, got to get big. Yeah, you will get big, but not in a good way.
If that's the only thing you're eating all day long, then perhaps, but...
Well, yeah, but you see guys that do that, and they're just like, yep, I got to have those calories at bedtime, stay anabolic. It's like, that's fine, but like have some Greek yogurt, have a casein shake, that, have a couple hundred calories extra, not 1,000 unless you want to, so anyway.
Yeah. All right. Just before we wrap up, what I like, obviously tons of stuff we didn't get to talk about, but let's just pick a nice, saucy, exciting question for last. I'm not sure if you're still prepping people or coaching people privately, but let's just, for the benefit of the question, let's assume you do. And someone asks you like, hey, Lyle, I still want to look jacked. I want to bulk, whatever, but I want to enjoy my alcohol. What do you tell that person?
Yeah, that's quite honestly, I was going to look into that in a lot of detail. Alcohol is really weird as a nutrient. Like it does have calories. It's treated very differently in the body. Like I talked about that hierarchy of nutrients where, kind of protein regulates itself, carbs regulate itself, and fat doesn't really do anything. When alcohol's in the system, it has to be burned over everything else, right? Alcohol is kind of a poison. If you drink, the body will burn that in over carbs, over fats, over anything else. At the same time, the predicted weight gain from alcohol doesn't show up in the studies. And they don't know why. There's actually 2 papers that they're called Alcohol, the Case of the Missing Calories. The calories are going somewhere, but nobody knows where. Mm-hmm. It's really, really weird. There's a gender difference. For men, drinking tends to be associated with a higher level of body weight and body mass index. In women, alcohol tends to be associated with a lower body mass index. However, this may be, I suspect it's social. Men tend to drink and eat fatty foods. And if you're drinking, all that calories coming in are getting stored. I think that, whereas women frequently drink instead of eating. A woman will go out with her friends, and all they'll do is drink wine. So they can get drunk and be that. Men will go drink and eat. I mentioned this to a friend of mine. She's like, I've seen girls my age that they start drinking and they gain a ton of weight, but they're drinking more like men do. They're drinking mixed drinks, eating wings. There's also some evidence that wine may be different than hard liquor. The answer is that I don't know. Where I'd actually point everybody, Martin Birkin of leangains.com wrote what I consider the most comprehensive article on alcohol and everything, because there's also a lot of fear that lots of alcohol may impair protein synthesis, and it's true if you give someone a bunch of alcohol right after training. I think like so many of these things in moderation, it's not that big of a deal. On those days, maybe adjust your other food down by couple hundred calories. I would definitely say avoid the alcohol with fatty wing type of approach. Like, again, that's an American, again, I don't know what other countries do, but it's all the same thing. You go to the bar, you go to the pub, you get your booze, you get your fatty foods. It's the combination that I think is really the issue. But honestly, he's looked into it more than I have. I think it can be done in moderation, certainly. You know, I've seen people go, well, I want to go binge drink twice a week. How do I make my training work? I'm like, you might want to address the binge drinking before you might want to address this before you try to gain the solution this. But I do think in moderation, certainly. And by moderation, you know, you're talking about a couple of drinks a night. You know, there's also the issue that, you know, a rum and Coke, well, guess what? The Coke's got a lot of sugar in it. Vodka cranberry.
Oh, yeah.
Really, I think a lot of it, you look at a lot of mixed drinks and you're adding a ton of sugar calories as much as the alcohol. You know, so you can get a rum and Diet Coke. We've got diets right in the U.S. You can get, you know, 7 and 7 over here. It's almost that as much, I think, as anything. Or, you know, at least do something harder. If you do shots of straight vodka and pass out early, you know, that will limit your drinking and eating for a little while. So there's another possible. I'm joking.
True.
Kind of. But you know, I would also warn people, if you're on a low-carb diet, alcohol will mess you up a lot faster. Because alcohol inhibits the liver's production of blood glucose. And when your blood glucose people get drunk way faster on low-carb diets. Which I guess is good if your goal is to get drunk and save some money, but just like be aware of that you can really get screwed up fast on drinking a lot of alcohol. So yeah, I think a couple drinks once or twice a week, or go out with your buddies and call it, if it fits your macros, and get over it. It's certainly not going to kill you. I think thinking that beer is a good post-workout drink, probably not so much.
Well, I guess.
But yeah, go read seriously. Martin's article is excellent. He did all the groundwork on that, and there's nothing I can say that will be better than that. That's at leangains.com.
All right, awesome. Well, Lyle, we covered some really cool topics, and you gave a lot of knowledge, and it was an honor to have you on. I will link to your website and all your resources in the show notes and in the intro. So thank you so much for coming on.
Very good. Thank you very much.
All right.